introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Jaivir Singh. I lead PwC's Global Office for Humanitarian Affairs, which essentially looks at strategic interventions in protracted displacement crises globally. Our partnership with UNHCR has been multi-country and multi-layered as well. Coming to Colombia 3 years ago, almost now, and looking at some of the unique contexts that Colombia has to face as we think about displacement, brought us to think about a deeper and more meaningful engagement of the private sector. In doing so, the initial pilot that we had, which was essentially to be able to build livelihoods for displaced populations from across the border, but also locally considering the substantive internal displacement in Colombia, was, I think, a successful pilot for us to be able to set a base for us to do more in country. It's with great pleasure, I think, that we've had that ability to see that success be the base for what we looked at in future. And once again, back here in Cali, I'm seeing the benefits of the first 6 months of the program that we've initiated in the middle of last year, and on the back of which I think broader private sector engagement is something that we are wanting to engage with and drive forward as we think about a more meaningful engagement with displaced communities. As I think about the Colombian context, with the UN, we've been able to perhaps look at a model that has already worked in Medellin in a somewhat different context, but having said that, I think so much of the planning that needs to happen as we think about these communities, it has to be curated to context. So one size does not fit all, and thus our partnership with UNHCR has helped us understand that context in a somewhat more nuanced way, where the private sector's engagement outside of the typical historical transactional relationships that happen between civil society and between the private sector need to go into more deeper, more meaningful, more embedded engagements. So our effort, once again here, is to be able to create a broader sensitivity amongst the private sector on the back of our own experiences as we think about protracted crises, not just in Colombia, but in the broader Latin American context. In doing so, we think that Colombia, sitting where it sits geographically, as well as from a political and from a societal context, is absolutely crucial as we think about future solutions which are more sustainable solutions for displaced populations, not just in country, but also those that are moving from other countries in the region. With the current dynamic of global humanitarian gaps in resources, we think that the need for the private sector to be engaged outside of those transactional relationships is absolutely crucial. In doing that, I think PwC's own engagements, not just in Colombia, but in the broader humanitarian context, is helping us learn those nuanced contexts for us to better understand what the private sector can bring to the table outside of the typical monetary relationships that have existed historically. So we're very pleased to be back in Cali, and on the back of the relationship that already exists, we hope that there will be many others that will also join this journey with us. I've always held the belief, and I think we've experienced that with our partners in country, especially with UNHCR, is that more conversations helps deliver deeper context. And I think that's a lot of what the private sector especially needs to understand. For UN agencies, UNHCR especially in country, civil society organizations, this is context that you live every day, but it's not one that the private sector lives every day. So how do you deliver that deeper context in terms of the value that displaced populations, and these are not just refugees, but even internally displaced populations, how can they be a deeper and more meaningful part of economic activity wherever they decide to settle? And by settle, I don't mean that that's always permanent settlement. This could also be settlement that moves. But just in the same way, in a globalized way, we were able to pivot as we think about generating value in different parts of the world. For economic activity, companies did that for many, many decades. I think we need to have the same lens as we think about societal upliftment in the world that we live in today. A world that is resource constrained, a world that is more complex in terms of the crises that it's facing, a world that has climate challenges of a particular kind, which are not just affecting one group of society, but all groups of society. And within that all groups of society, is very much the private sector as well. So if you think about the real stakeholders, there's government, the private sector, and civil society institutions. I think more responsibility as we think about some of the pressures that the world faces today rest upon the private sector, because it's not just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do for business.